Okay. Uh, Thanks everyone who's tuned in. We had a little technical issues delaying us, but we're here now and we're ready to go. Very excited to start this afternoon's program. I'd like to welcome those who are joining us live for this next installment of our irregular series of author talks on Jersey City history, hosted by the New Jersey Room, which is the local history department of the Jersey City Free Public Library. And welcome those who are watching this as a recording as well. Our guest today is Dr. Walter D. Greason, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Educational Counseling and Leadership at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey. Since 2010, he has written or edited 9 books on the history of racial segregation and its economic consequences. In his 2013 book, Suburban Erasure, How the Suburbs Ended the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey, Dr. Greason makes the point that in contrast to how we tend to view the great migration of African Americans from the South in the first half of the 20th century as a rural to urban migration to places like Detroit, Chicago, or New York City, in New Jersey, it was rural areas that saw the bulk of migration in the first phase of the Great Migration following World War I. The demographic shift in New Jersey cities, such as Jersey City, would come later, during and after the Great Depression and the Second World War. In our previous talk online, Joseph Murray and James Fisher discussed the political history of those mid-century years as the political machine run so effectively by longtime Mayor Frank Hague failed to meet the challenges of changing economy and political climate. Dr. Greason will talk about that same time period from a socioeconomic and demographic perspective. And I'm grateful that he has agreed to spend some time with us here today and to enrich our perspective on this crucial period in the modern history of Jersey City. I'm going to stop sharing this title screen now and say hi to Dr. Greason face to face. Thanks for making the time today. A busy academic schedule, even in this online environment. So again, just happy to have you here.
John, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. The institution, Jersey City Free Public Library, is the kind of place that we need to celebrate and uplift every chance we get. And your work in particular, I'm honored for your invitation and hope we can do many more things together. As you mentioned, this is just a ridiculously crazy summer with the pandemic and so many other kinds of ways that we're seeing public protests against social injustice. My day in particular today, the work of the graduate program here in the School of Ed is busier in July and August than it is any other time of year. So I'm just getting off of a dissertation defense of an extraordinary young man, and I'm running into another class to meet in another hour or so. So I'm just glad we could put it all together.
Here I thought I was catching you in your downtime. I should know better than to think that there's any downtime.
Maybe around Thanksgiving.
All right, well, maybe we can do round 2 then, but.
Oh, that'd be lovely. No, thank you so much. This is such an important topic, and Jersey City is a vital place to really engage it. So I hope, the talk I can offer today will help for whoever's listening, whether you're in Jersey City or elsewhere, that you can start to understand your community and the opportunities we have right now in more depth.
So I understand you have some slides to share and talk about, and we will be able to take questions on the YouTube chat if any come in during the live presentation. And then, of course, we'll monitor comments as we go forward too. If for folks who are watching this on recording, please feel free to comment with questions, and we'll try and get back with information to you. So with that, I'm going to turn off my camera and mic and turn the forum over to you, Dr. Greason.
All right. Did we want to record this, or is this already in process?
Oh, it's recording. It's streaming live on YouTube. Yeah.
Good. All right. So redlining, segregation, suburbanization, these are some of the most common topics I've had to address throughout my career. And particularly when we look at the state of New Jersey and the major urban centers throughout the state, I find that we don't talk about it enough, and it often leaves our students and our citizens generally not equipped to engage in a lot of public policy debate and how to stand up for their ideas of freedom and how do they pursue their idea of a stable economic and family life. All these things are created out of obstacles because we don't understand the middle of the 20th century and how the state of New Jersey changed in some pretty profound ways. And that's what I want to try and focus on for the next few minutes. And I'm really grateful to talk about it because too often now I'm focused just on particular schools or school districts, and I don't get to talk enough about the broader patterns and the systems of how our state economy operates and how the politics of the state have evolved. And now under Governor Murphy, and as we deal with the pandemic response, we need this information more than we've ever needed it before. So I was going to start out by saying I'm Walter Greason. I'm teaching in educational counseling and leadership, but I am primarily an urban historian, focuses on processes of industrialization and segregation from 1870 to 1950. But within that, that foundation has helped me to make arguments and create new bodies of evidence regarding suburban growth. And as we see the world economy change in the second half of the 20th century, the emergence of suburbs becomes increasingly important. And especially in the last 20 years, people have come to recognize that the suburbs are where the majority of Americans live. I was astonished to see a new book come out about the state of Texas that argued that Texas is a suburban state, taking my thesis about New Jersey and some of the earlier work in sociology about California. And now they're saying, oh, suburbs are everywhere, including Texas. And it's really that process that I hope we can start to get a little bit more information about it in the next few minutes, that what we see as redlining and segregation in urban spaces, whether it's New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, anywhere, those things deeply impact regional development in New Jersey and now around the world. China is going through these processes. Eastern Europe is going through these processes. The folks who I talk with the most are seeing that global suburbanization is one of the fundamental kind of problems, maybe just a process that we have to confront in the context of climate change and how we understand sustainable development through the remainder of this century and into the 22nd century. And so that's my basic approach to why it's important to do this talk today about Jersey City. Oh, my slideshow, there we go. Took a second to load. At the foundation of it is understanding redlining. And thankfully, from when I started doing this work in the late 80s and early 90s, now redlining is pretty well recognized. People don't look at me cross-eyed when I start to describe the process of banks and real estate offices having maps that showed where you could actually secure loans so that you could actually get homeowners to acquire their first home or second home, or where they could do repairs, or where businesses could start up. The idea that there were maps that then at some point the federal government began endorsing which areas were safe to lend to, which were higher risk, which ones were absolutely to be denied, and then the lowest category are these redlined areas. That's pretty common now. And it's taken about 30 years to convince the public to take the power of redlining very seriously and make it a part of how we understand our nation and the way it functions. At its base, it's a form of economic discrimination. It's saying that some people can be trusted to manage money responsibly, and most people cannot. That in fact, protecting for financial risk as a lender is a priority, and that we have to have simplified rules to kind of protect lenders from unnecessary risks, so that those who are most trustworthy, most responsible, are the ones who gain access to capital, and that they can then shape the way a neighborhood, a city, a state will evolve. And so understanding the way credit markets work, understanding the way amortization guidelines operate, we see this all change in the middle of the 1930s, especially under the Second New Deal. being able to extend loans beyond a 5 or 7 or 10-year term at a relatively low interest rate by offering a federal guarantee that if someone does not repay, that the bank will not be held liable, that the Federal Reserve System will cover the losses. Um, that that became a huge revelation for most Americans in 2008 and 2009 as the housing market crashed. But that was the foundation of what made the housing market explode through the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Led to issues with interest rates in the early 1980s, but then stabilized, and deregulation of the financial markets in the 80s and 90s set the table for what collapsed in 2007 and 2008. And so in a place like Jersey City that had been a kind of thriving small industrial center in New Jersey, the process of redlining facilitated many working and middle class families to move out to the outer lying communities, out to these rural areas that were becoming suburbs in the 50s and 60s, while at the same time, the discrimination within the process of redlining prevented newer immigrants, and particularly people who were Hispanic or Jewish or African American, from getting the same kinds of opportunities. Those opportunities to move into the suburbs for the populations that were discriminated against didn't really start to unfold until the late 1960s and early 1970s in significant numbers. And so you see the suburbs begin to diversify in the 80s and 1990s, but especially after about 1997, 1998, that led to about a decade of real reform in allowing fair housing access to all housing, even in the suburbs. And that's what became a big headline a couple days ago when President Trump directed the Housing and Urban Development Authority to revoke a lot of these fair access rules. And so that process is an attempt to reverse access to suburban housing and restore some form of redlining going forward. And that's now become a big issue for this current year and for this election. So that's why it was really timely, I think, for us to host this conversation today. My particular approach to it is a little different from most of the scholars who look at this, is that redlining as an urban phenomenon, if you look at it in Brooklyn, if you look at it in Queens or in the Bronx, certainly large parts of Manhattan, it's very clear to see how segregation evolves in northern and midwestern cities. So Chicago and New York are really the places that are most studied when it comes to these questions. But for me, when I started writing my dissertation and continued to revise it as a monograph, suburban erasure was about not just the transformation of places like Newark or Trenton or Atlantic City and Camden, but ultimately when you looked out to the urban fringe and into rural areas. So I started out looking at Monmouth County here in New Jersey, and looking at places like Asbury Park and Red Bank and Long Branch, Freehold Borough. Those were going through similar kinds of processes on the opposite end of the spatial scale. That is, they were rural areas aggressively being transformed into suburbs by the same kind of factors in federal lending guidelines that were decimating cities through the 1950s and 1960s. And so in Jersey City, this transformation of the financial infrastructure and the way that we organized the underwriting of landscape design, that begins to push folks who had been immigrant families in the 1920s to be able to afford moving into better neighborhoods and even outside of Jersey City entirely. And one of the key ways I need the folks who are listening to understand this change is to look at the scale of regional development. And so that's the key phrase on this particular slide, that what had been kind of isolated, provincial, small towns and communities, even smaller cities, were now connected in profound ways that were unimaginable in even the era of trolley cars and railroads. The transformation of suburban New Jersey and of New Jersey as a suburban state between 1937 and 1974 is about looking at the way New York and Philadelphia as metropolitan regions reshaped the Garden State. and that green space was seen as the opportunity to expand both industrial and residential development in ways that were underwritten by the federal government to generate enormous private profits that real estate developers, and at the heart of what I look at is the K. Hovnanian company, Kervar Hovnanian's real estate development in central New Jersey, even the idea of central New Jersey itself, that's all a product of these financial and economic reforms. And so if you look at the growth of New York and Philadelphia, and particularly for Jersey City, New York, it's these waves of outmigration from Brooklyn, from Staten Island, from the Bronx and Queens that is changing the way the city is developing in this time period. In Philadelphia to the south, it has a similar effect around Camden and out to Cherry Hill, through Camden County and Gloucester County and down towards Atlantic City, on a much smaller and slower pace, because the Philadelphia economy just is tiny compared to the New York City metropolitan economy. But that regional scale where you're seeing metropolitan suburbanization through northern New Jersey and southern New Jersey, how that begins to connect and form infrastructure transformations like the Garden State Parkway or the New Jersey Turnpike. All of this and the reliance on automobile travel, the expansion of airports like Newark, Philadelphia International, all of this is fueling an entirely different understanding of region, that the region is changing from being something that in a train ride, it might take you a day to go, outside of the Northeast corridor, to the fact of air travel being that you could commute effectively to Orlando or Miami, Florida from New York or Philadelphia. These transportation reforms make Jersey City less central to the way the state's economy operates. And it undermines our conversation yesterday with John was a lot about kind of the longshoremen and the commercial shipping that happened there that is just less necessary. It becomes a major feature of giant ports like Newark and New York or San Francisco. These places become much more important in terms of shipping and transportation, but it's the consumer automobile travel, consumer and commercial air travel that absolutely transforms the region. And so geographers talk about the Northeast corridor. They have a nickname for it called Boss Wash, Boston to Washington. And even now, it's actually stretched down further. It stretches through Richmond, Virginia. It stretches through Charlotte, North Carolina, along the I-95 corridor. But this is all one giant, what they call megapolitan, not metropolitan. It is a megapolitan. And so Jersey City has to redefine itself in relationship to this kinds of geographic shift, that it's the same landmass, but the transportation and communication infrastructure just completely revolutionizes the experience of living in these places. And so suburban erasure is just the rural version of the consolidation of this transportation corridor, that now you'll see Amazon coming into play in the next 10 to 15 years, where just storage and the use of drones to ship goods throughout the region is just transforming all of New Jersey again. And so that process is all reliant on the habits of redlining, the assumptions of redlining that had taken hold over the previous 60, 70 years. Oh, there we go. So the last way I want you guys to think about redlining is in terms of how scholars have written about it. And there are really two major sources to kind of take into account here that follow in the footsteps of Kenneth Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier in terms of how do we look at metropolitan change. And we're now in like the third or fourth generation of writers talking about this. But on the one hand, taking the basic formulation of redlining as neighborhoods scored A, B, C, or D, and then who determines what quality A neighborhood is to get a loan, why A or classified D neighborhoods for immigrants and racial minorities are denied any access to capital. Kevin Cruz at Princeton, one of his books, I think he published this while he was still at Penn, it's called White Flight, and it looks at the politics of maintaining segregation as you get things like the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and that white flight, the migration of families who aspire to escape neighborhoods affected by the rising political power of Black and Latino residents, that white flight to the suburbs transforms not just the balance of power in any single state, but shifts profoundly the political influence of the nation from being based in the industrial Midwest and the financial kind of intellectual Northeast to the consolidation of the Sun Belt that stretches from Los Angeles in the West to across Houston and across Atlanta with a branch that goes down to Miami, but ends up at Charlotte, North Carolina. That there is essentially this Gulf and Pacific Coast coalition of white residents who, not just in terms of moving physically to places like Orange County, California, or the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, but they're also bringing massive new investment. And I think some of my favorite writing on the topic comes about the shift in Congress that moved military-based funding out of the Midwest and Northeast and shifted it towards the Sun Belt. So you have these huge military bases that actually provide billions of dollars in capital on an annual basis across the Sun Belt that also kind of underwrite the white flight that Kevin Cruz describes. And so although Jim Crow was formally abolished through the work of people like Martin Luther King and Fannie Barrier Williams, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and John Lewis, this de facto segregation is actually reinforced through the development of the Sun Belt and the reinforcement of largely white suburban economic development. Doesn't have to rely on the rigid and obvious forms of urban redlining any longer, but just protecting the suburbs from a diversity of people moving into them replicates a lot of the same economic injustice. Within that, a really important kind of sub-trend is that Arnold Hirsch talks about the second ghetto. And the second ghetto is the ability of well-educated African Americans and immigrant populations to then move out of these first ghettos, places where people didn't have any real opportunity within cities, and then to move into affordable suburbs that are also kind of restricted by race, ethnicity, and national origin. And so in older suburbs that had often been Irish or Italian, places that European immigrants, Eastern European immigrants had moved into, often Catholic communities. After 1970, they transitioned into becoming Black and Latino communities, immigrant communities, South Asian immigrants, Middle Eastern immigrants. And those places, as they become more diverse and they're economically not as well off as it had been for working and middle class Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants and their families, it's still better off than the worst communities in a place like Chester or the worst neighborhoods of Camden, that there are no real chances for people to gain education that's effective, to be able to escape poverty and violence and addiction in the 80s and the 90s. And so that second ghetto of working class minority neighborhoods in the suburbs begins to complicate the policies of exclusion that had defined suburbs in the 50s and 60s. And so the combination of white flight as we've understood it and the consolidation of these second ghettos in the suburbs created what sociologist William Julius Wilson called the truly disadvantaged, those who were left at the absolute bottom of the American economy with no real chance to improve their lives, and their entire social structure kind of disintegrated around them. And this, again, and you look at this in the way, what happens to Newark, what happens in some of the oranges, Patterson, You see this evolving in the more recent past around Jersey City and through North Jersey, is that there are these places of enormous affluence, but at the same time, there are places that are just, in the terms of the banks, blighted, that they kind of leave them and neglect them is really the policy prescription. In the mid 1970s, Pat Robertson began to talk to Richard Nixon about the idea of benign neglect and leaving these areas to kind of collapse and to be heavily policed and to be hollowed out by mass incarceration. And that those folks were not worth investing in. They didn't need to even consider redlining because there was just a commitment to ignore the problem and to let it get to be as bad as possible. So that sets the table for like the last 20 to 30 years, where we look at suburbanization. And a lot of the work I've done since 2015 is around this principle called property wins. And the book I published in 2016 is American Economy, and it looks at over a 200-year period, the comparative legal emphasis on our inalienable rights, that there are rights to life, rights to liberty, and rights to pursue happiness. But the right to pursue happiness under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution becomes the right to property. And just rhetorically, we've essentially made them equivalent in the way we think about constitutional law, that life, liberty, and property are sacrosanct. And we go to great lengths to secure individual protections of those three things. When looked at from the perspective of the folks who have experienced segregation, however, particularly coming out of experiences of slavery, even in the North, in places like Massachusetts and New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania, this notion that property is more important than life and liberty becomes quite apparent, that the quality of your life, the ability to protect your liberty is contingent on your ability to hold property, that the more property you have, the more ability you have to protect your life and liberty. And over and over again, I'm really excited that this thesis has caught on, and many people are documenting it in a variety of ways. But if most recently, there was a HBO television show called The Watchmen that opened with a recreation, a dramatic recreation of the Greenwood massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where hundreds of African Americans were killed and their property seized, and they were extraordinarily wealthy, that their life and liberty and their property were all in jeopardy simply because they were African American. And in less violent ways, the process of what we've seen of globalization since 1974, 1975 has reinforced this notion that property and ultimately wealth is all that matters, that the principles of human dignity and equality, those are secondary. Those cannot be upheld legally unless someone has extraordinary amounts of property. And so that's one of the problems as we look at suburbanization as a driving force in global development. Here, I wanted to share just a brief piece about New Jersey from the American Economy book that I published back in 2016. This is an asset value analysis of the state of New Jersey in 2010. And it really dramatically reflects what happened to the state as a result of a consumer shift that Elizabeth Cohen describes. It's a consumer's republic. The more that you buy, the more freedom that you feel that you have, and that housing, along with cars, become these symbols of your consumer status, your citizenship status. And so when you do an asset value analysis, you're looking at census data, you're looking at business receipts, you're looking at kind of industrial development, which kinds of sectors are growing or shrinking over the course of a decade. And so I believe this was pretty contemporary. So this was looking at the 2012 data for New Jersey. And the numbers, you can't see everything here, but what I wanted to emphasize is that when you look at Essex, Hudson, and Union County combined, they're over $700 billion in asset value in 2012. It's nothing comparable in the rest of the state. There's just enormous wealth concentrated immediately adjacent to New York City. And so Jersey City is a huge part of that, is that the decline of parts of the city during the 1970s and 1980s actually presents a massive investment opportunity. And so when you look at a place like Hoboken and its redevelopment, that's what you're seeing manifest in the last 20 to 30 years with the concentration of wealth just across the river from Lower Manhattan. In a similar way, if you were to compare Monmouth County to Ocean County, just wild difference in the amount of wealth that gets aggregated there. It's about 190 billion in Monmouth County versus, something like it's 24 billion in Ocean. The more rural the area, the sparser the population, the less access to asset value. And it's based on a combination of not just natural resources or industrial and commercial investment, but ultimately how many people live there and their level of education, their skill level, what they are doing to generate their own economic autonomy. And that's what we see in these three counties to the north where Jersey City is located. There's just enormous creativity and value and compounding investment underwritten by both the state and the federal government, not to mention the regional commercial networks that run through the region. And so the problem has been that we underwrote home ownership for everybody, regardless of whether or not they own businesses. And so this is what drove the collapse of the national housing market. And we may see this again in the next month to 2 months, is that by underwriting housing, we create enormous financial risk because we don't provide people with ways to generate and maintain their own level of income. That you see with the PPP program that's unfolded in the last 4 months. We do a great deal for business owners to make sure they continue operations, that they can maintain payrolls, that they do not collapse and go into bankruptcy. Even before the PPP program and the onset of the coronavirus, there was 6-7 months of Federal Reserve action to flood trillions of dollars of capital into the marketplace so that businesses could sustain in the event of an economic downturn. And so it's this commercial risk that we're willing to tolerate. We want people to take the risk to start new enterprises, to build companies, to be the next Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. That we've done for over 150 years in some really aggressive ways. But by believing that housing was a consumer investment, that everybody should essentially buy a home and own a home, that started with these processes of redlining, we inverted the way the market works and was designed to work here. That we didn't actually provide people with a stable way to multiply their income and to get lots of different ways of making money every week or every month, so that after they have a strong business, they can then acquire a home. We changed it to let's underwrite and make it cheaper for them to get a home. And then as they pay down the debt related to the home, they can leverage the equity in the home to then start a small business. And it worked for a number of decades, particularly in the sense of an exclusive real estate market where there are a lot of people who were still denied the right to get to a house. But the underlying equation of paying down debt on a home to then use equity to start a small business over time, and especially when you're guaranteeing equal access, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And so getting more people to actually have multiple streams of income, that they're generating more revenue for themselves, and then with multiple streams of income, acquire a home, it makes the entire economy much more stable and ultimately undermines and destroys the need for redlining and the kinds of residential segregation that we've seen in the last 100 years. And so as I start to wrap up this piece and see if other folks want to engage with questions, I want you to understand the nature of digital property, that the idea of property has evolved a couple times in American history, that it starts with the idea of owning a farm or especially a plantation, where the physical labor to generate something like cotton or tobacco or sugar or corn, that's the way that you're going to begin to kind of access a larger commercial marketplace in most of the 19th century. But then as that moves towards banking and oil and coal, steel industries, mineral related industries. Through the late 19th and early 20th century, that property receives priority and gets greater tax protection. And it allows the American economy to become the largest economy in the world, even after a Great Depression, and sets the table for us to win the Cold War through the middle of the 20th century. But what we're living with now, and really since about 1970, especially since the mid 1990s, is an idea of digital property. And this is what we're seeing take root in the consumer markets in places like Jersey City. But this digital property has to be about the way our young people create networks that serve financial systems, that evolve them, that change our medical and healthcare infrastructure, that allow for kind of greater engineering innovations, easy for me to say. And so that process of seeing where the economy is going next and how we get our middle school and high school students to participate in it, not as employees, but as owners and investors before they get to their 25th birthday, that's really the future of where a place like Jersey City lies, and really the entire state of New Jersey and the entire megapolitan region from Boston down to Orlando. We have a unique market advantage in the world with an extraordinarily well-educated population and unmatched infrastructure for us to make new enterprises grow. But we have to dismantle segregation as a barrier to wealth creation. And the first step towards doing that is abandoning destructive policies like redlining. And so the image on the right is a artistic rendering of the data set I have about the world economy 100 years ago. And the relative strength of Great Britain is the white line here, France, Russia. So the United States was just beginning to really exert its industrial strength. And it's astonishing that 100 years ago, the world economy looked so completely different. To me, that's enormously inspiring in that 100 years from now, I don't think we have to live with the kinds of problems and barriers that we face. If you're curious about the subtle distinctions here, this points out in 1900 how much natural resources contributed to the strength of a regional economy or national economy. Japan and Britain did not really rely on natural resources. It's a lot of stuff about their physical infrastructure for Russia and Japan. Germany, more balanced. The United States turning towards its human capital, and that was modeled after the British model about how they built a highly educated and adaptive population to maintain the empire. And so those processes and how we start to understand them in more detail, that's what we need to do here in New Jersey, in Jersey City, as we prepare for the remainder of this century and the next century. If you're interested in talking more about any of this, I have a brand new website up. It's walterdgrayson.com. And there's a newsletter you can subscribe to that talks about these issues every week called Fluid Dynamics. And I'd love to kind of have this continuing conversation. I get to do a little bit of it through my work at the university, but it's always so much more rewarding when I get to work with people in their businesses, in their communities, and help them take advantage of a lot of the patterns that we're not very good at documenting or analyzing in today's world. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Grayson. Let me just find my camera button here. There I am. You certainly packed a lot into a short amount of time there. We have a smallish audience online. I'm going to wait to see if we get any questions that come in through the comments or chat function there. There's a bit of a delay between you and I here and what's going on YouTube, but
no, if you have a question or a comment, that'll give them time to get their thoughts together.
Well, yeah, no, gosh, I have so many little notes here about things that we could talk about. Maybe we'll start going backwards though, because it's nice that you really brought it up into the present and the possibilities for development and change. And Jersey City and this metropolitan region's role in the global economy as what some have called the global cities, as in this financial hub, um, which is an interesting field of discourse. I'm not sure. Uh, what I what I'm wondering about is how you can create policies that affect things on a regional level. Because I mean, in New Jersey, we have this problem of we just like to create more and more municipalities. We like to split up and have home rule in a small, you got a dozen of your friends and you want to start a new town, you can, that's generally how people have done it. And so if you look at this past century of attempting to plan this region, from going back to like the Regional Plan Association, or the attempts of the Port Authority to really function as a bi-state agency, or the Delaware Valley Authority on the other end of the state. What do you think needs to come into existence, or what levers are there, do you think, for effective control and maybe positive influence on economic development in a just fashion on a regional scale? I know we talk about redlining, which has had negative consequences. But what do you think, what tools are there that exist or need to be developed to address this, regional development?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion in Trenton and around the state about the idea of a state bank that underwrites and provides better forms, lower interest rates for infrastructure development that's more accountable at the local level. And that's a pretty dramatic intervention. Like insurance companies, private financial institutions don't want to see the state competing to kind of lower their profit margins. And so that's a hard thing. Like that's a powerful lobby of financial institutions to try and say they're not doing enough to really help out working families. But I do think those are the kinds of negotiations that can dramatically transform our state. In addition, there's what I've focused on since I wrote Suburban Erasure was regional cooperatives. So ways that multiple municipalities within a county or across county lines can leverage their general municipal authority. So a lot of people fear consolidation because it means the loss of, a council person or the way the representation works, and the League of Municipalities in the state would never really go for it. But there are ways that they're already doing it when it comes to providing for fire protection, for policing. They're entering into agreements where they share these responsibilities so they're not multiplying costs. And I think where I live, there's a regional high school. There are high schools in each municipality, but the students can travel and choose which school is going to actually do the best work for them. And it's a public school system, and it's one of the most extraordinary ones in the state. It underwrites the high-tech high school program at Brookdale Community College that is one of the best in the country and the world. So the ways that we are creative with regional partnership, to me, is a really concrete way we can move forward. And I hope that becomes part of the way we discuss, what we can do here in New Jersey as the next election cycle comes. Like this time next year, we're looking at the governor's election. We're looking at the way folks are campaigning to be in the state Senate and legislature. They need to pay attention to regional partnerships that make it that our facilities are really responsive, that our social institutions are really engaged and empowering our citizens, whether they're homeowners or not. And I think it would make a much more cohesive and stable state as a whole.
Okay. Megan says here, and you have to excuse me, I have to lean over to read on a different computer. Your comments about housing finance versus business investment were interesting. So are you of the mind that people should not use debt to finance their housing? Or is it too late by now to change?
Yeah, we've got a long-term bad habit, and the general way that we've provided a shield from risk, like we protected banks and insurance companies pretty effectively with the federal agencies that kind of keep the housing market going. It would be enormous to suddenly cut that off. Like you would collapse the US economy and a good chunk of the world economy in an effort to really change that in a fast way. So that would be irresponsible. I'm not in the spot of trying to lay off, 250 million people in the space of 6 months. Like that would be very big. And so what I would say instead is we need to be more thoughtful and careful about the way we tweak those markets to work, and that we can't have a market that essentially is driving constantly appreciating home values. The stuff that's happening in a place like San Francisco, or even in large sections of the New York metro in Brooklyn, you've got to maintain a commitment to affordable housing. And New Jersey is better than most states when it came to the Mount Laurel decision and trying to find ways to make sure there was affordable housing, because most people are not growing their incomes by 2 and 3-fold every few years. That if you're making $50,000 or $70,000, you know, if 20 years later you're making 100, you did pretty well. But inflation chews up a lot of that value. So how do you actually keep a market that works for working families and for the lower middle class? And there are ways you can do that, not just through regional partnerships, but through subsidies that don't drive developers to constantly seek the highest luxury rate profit. And we haven't built markets in housing that do that well. And we also don't, that the other end of it for me is these kinds of institutions that allow people to multiply their incomes more. And so a lot of the work I try to do is with middle schoolers and high schoolers and teachers, thinking about, okay, so yeah, I made $35,000 or $55,000 last year. How do I actually concretely take the little bit of extra money I'm able to save, $5,000, $7,000, if that, and actually turn that into a new stream of income that generates another $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 a year? And if you repeat that process over a decade, all of a sudden someone who was making $50,000 a year is probably close to $200,000 a year by the end of the decade. And it's a completely different growth model for them to be able to pull it off. And so that's one of the core lessons for me, is that it's not just about cutting costs and making housing affordable. It's also about growing income opportunities and expanding the ways that people can participate in the market and benefit from and earn the value of their time. That their time is not settled for the lowest rate they can negotiate with an employer.
There's financial literacy is such an important skill that really traditionally hasn't been taught in our schools. I think I could benefit from that. Those lessons you were talking about. I should have to go back and kind of listen to that.
All of us.
I think my mom was trying to tell me that for years, and typically I didn't listen to my mom until it was too late. But David writes, great discussion. You commented that the current and historic housing model is unsustainable. I think we've talked a little bit about this since he asked this question. If so, should home ownership remain a public policy priority? And if not, is redlining less a current issue? And then that is, should other policies be embraced to create equitable access to opportunity? And I think you were just talking about this a little bit, but I don't know if you want to comment any further on that.
Yeah, no, I'm completely against anything that looks like redlining continuing, and I would do the opposite. There's a lot of these places that talk about greenlining, identifying areas that haven't had investment under these previous policies and dedicating access to capital so that they can begin the process of rebuilding and provide really great opportunities to the people who live in them. So if you ever Google greenlining in terms of like urban redevelopment, there are programs, and Cory Booker pioneered one of them with his enterprise zones, that he wanted to see more growth in terms of the private market, but oftentimes it just fueled gentrification because it didn't protect local homeowners, local renters. And so trying to kind of find the solution that deals with people who are really vulnerable economically, that reduces their vulnerability first and creates stability, but then allows their stability to kind of grow into their chance to like acquire new resources and their real democratic participation, both politically and economically. Those are the kinds of things I really like to experiment with at the municipal and at the county level, because there are so many resources, but we just don't mobilize them well.
Yeah, and that issue of unintended consequences of these responses to urban decline or issues, whether it was the historic districts and bringing people in, or the urban enterprise zones, and how they seem to, despite best intentions, replicate the inequalities of the system. It's a tough
Yeah,
nut to crack, you know.
I was reading about the debates around the mayor in Jersey City. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Is it Fulop?
Fulop, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Some of the controversy around kind of contracting and this idea of a strategic plan of how do you actually go about redevelopment. You know, like we can't let the process fall victim to political expedience. And it's a really hard process. It's going to take not 1 year or 2 year or 5 years. It's going to take generations of changing really bad habits that we just assumed are the only way we can do business. And so that's why I try to deal with folks who are young and just starting out in the process. But it works at any level. You know, there are senior citizens groups I talk to that then end up working with their kids and their grandkids to change bad habits. And so the more we have the conversation, the better the options we're going to have.
Okay, I know you've got a
Right
busy
up against
schedule
it.
today,
Yeah.
but we do have just a couple more questions we can try and they're probably not questions that can be easily addressed, but we'll do it. We'll do our best. Isaac asks if the U.S. government decided to issue reparations to African Americans for redlining, as well as the other historic, you know, inequities, to put it mildly. In your opinion, what would that look like?
Yeah, so you're going to see very shortly. We have a very detailed plan coming out in September that talks about that question. I work with a really famous economist named William Darity, and he's down at Duke University. He's one of these folks. I suspect in the next couple of years he's going to win a Nobel Prize for his work. He has gone through and worked out an extraordinary set of proposals that vary from each state and each county even, for what a reparations plan should look like for people who have been damaged by these kinds of inequities. And so it's extraordinary. It is the most ambitious design for a reparations plan I've seen. I consulted on it about the housing interventions, so I can walk through those in great detail. But the general principle is that folks who are still facing the kinds of depredation and environmental degradation, the disparate health outcomes that have come from segregation need to be repaired, need to be healed. And it's not just one group, or it's their children and their grandchildren. And the habits have stretched back 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. And so reinvesting purposefully is absolutely essential. And, you know, people get caught up on the term reparations and how does it actually work? I would strongly urge them. Darity has a new book out called From Here to Equality. It is just spectacular. And so if you want to take a look at the book, you'll see the agenda. We're going to be debating it in Congress through September and October.
It's such a great point. When you talk about reparations, we're not talking about for something that happened 150 years ago and ended. We're talking about a system that was based on that system and carried it forward, you know, through the 20th century and into today. So we'll wait and see.
Oh yeah,
please. That conversation. And finally, we'll take one more question, if you don't mind, real quick. Megan asks a follow-up question. Do you think limited equity models like co-ops will, with flip taxes and resale income level limits and community land trusts, are a good policy for moving housing away from an investment model? And forgive me if I read that a little clumsily. Did you get the sense of the question there?
Yes, no,
Okay.
That's someone who knows a great deal about all of these questions and issues. So yes, is my basic answer. I've done a lot of work.
The question to me, so I can understand what I just asked you.
The idea of alternative economic models that actually use the kinds of wealth that we have, but allow it to benefit multiple users. So it's not just privately held wealth, but it's actually community wealth. And this is a pretty basic idea. Like from the founding of the Republic, we had the phrase commonwealth. And that concept that there is a public good and there are ways to underwrite it, not just through taxes, not just through philanthropy, but through structured and principled reinvestment. Those are the kinds of initiatives that Megan is putting on the table for us here. And so my work in cooperatives comes down to 3 areas: is essentially free clothing, free food, and free energy. And so for folks who are struggling, folks who are trying to get back on their feet, those kinds of targeted interventions where there are ways to get the resources you need to start to put your life back together, those are absolutely essential. And it should go without saying that it also applies to our health and wellness, that none of us go through life without an injury or some kind of time of limited capacity. And some of us just have longer periods of it than others. And so dealing with the ways that we care for each other is really profound, and that cannot be driven by the profit motive.
So where did I hear that expression, promote the general welfare? I know I read that somewhere. So maybe if we could get that into law somewhere, the notion, I don't know. Well, I just really want to thank you for a great talk and great discussion today. And there's really a lot to chew on here. And I think this will be of lasting value, and it's part of an ongoing conversation, and just really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Your work is a model. I'm inspired. Anytime I can come back and support any of the programs, please just let me know.
Okay, now I'm going to attempt to sign off on YouTube. We'll have the awkward moment where I'm trying to sign off on YouTube. I'm going to stop my video to make it that much less awkward.